City of Canby, good evening. The purpose of tonight's work session is to give the Planning Commission the opportunity to discuss the housing needs analysis update. To make the most of the short time we are given for these meetings, public comment will not be taken. This is appropriate under Oregon Public Meetings Law. Instead, we invite public comment at all of the Planning Commission regular meetings under either of the two opportunities dedicated on each agenda for public comment. In addition, we invite the public to contact city staff with comments or concerns. Although this is a public meeting, the Planning Commission cannot make any formal decision in a work session. Next step actions are often determined for deliberation and discussion at a properly noticed Planning Commission meeting. Don, do you want to take the agenda item?
Chair Ellison, I was just going to ask that we go ahead and do the call to order and do the pledge, and then if we could go through the draft findings. It's fine that you read that into the record, and I'll just launch into the work session once that is, but if we could start with the pledge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I should have printed that one. Okay, consent items. We have a consent item for the draft final findings, DR 22-05, LLA 22-05, Backstop Brewing.
And we're looking for a motion and a second to approve those minutes.
Okay, do we have a motion to approve the minutes as written?
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes for DR 22-05, LLA 22-05, Backstop Brewing as submitted.
I second.
I second. Oh.
Okay. And then we take a vote.
Just a clarification, those are, I'm sorry, final findings, and these are final findings for approval versus minutes. So yes, just making that clarification.
Roger that. Okay. And then we take a vote.
Yep.
Okay, so we'll start to my right, Mr. Hutchinson. Or is all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Against? None? It is approved.
So the next item would be citizen input on non-agenda items. And since we're not seeing anyone in the chambers and I don't see anybody on Zoom, we'll assume that there's no citizen input.
Very good. And under new business, we have none. Public hearings, we have none, which takes us to the Planning Commission work session. And we are going to be discussing the housing needs analysis update presented by Don Hardy, Planning Director.
Good evening, Chair Ellison and Commissioners. This is another work session, and I know we've had several on this, but I think it's important as we move this forward for housing, and I'm also including an employment piece to this as well to give an update. This is all going to lead to a March 13th Planning Commission hearing for housing production strategy and a March 27th hearing for economic opportunity assessment. The Planning Commission's role in this will be largely advisory, but I'm looking for recommendations from the Planning Commission to go to Council, and that includes things like word, text, those kinds of items as we get into some of the strategies and objectives, strategies for housing and objectives for employment. So those are things that could be forwarded and ended up modified as a recommendation going before Council. So tonight I just wanted to maybe rewind a little bit because some of this is, I think, wanting to make sure it's clear in terms of how it's all structured and how it all kind of works together. First of all, I think that's an important element. And then secondly, just what this means in terms of going forward with schedule. So there were two Department of Land Conservation and Development grants that were provided to the City of Canby for housing production and housing needs. Those two were provided to us. And the housing needs versus the housing production, I know the names are very similar, just kind of basically in a boilerplate. Housing needs is about the needs of the community, 20-year needs based on buildable lands analysis work that shows how many housing units are needed over a 20-year horizon. The housing production strategy are strategies to address housing affordability over the next 20 years. And it would be based on housing needs analysis, which would be the buildable lands, including planned timelines for strategy adoptions. And the strategy adoptions really address housing affordability as we move forward. There was also an employment grant that we received as well, and that really is focusing on a 20-year horizon for commercial and industrial employment, and that's another item that's important here. All these grants really need to be, well, the housing production strategy and the economic opportunity analysis both need to be approved by council by May. We have grant requirements in order to get reimbursed for the funding that was part of that. So if this seems like repeat, I think my goal would be by the time we get to the hearing, you guys are like well up to speed and this is not mysterious at all. There also will be an open house tomorrow evening on these topics, and there'll be consultants here to present at 6 o'clock. So they'll go through this. I'm doing more of a high level review and they're going to get into a little bit more detail tomorrow night. So the next item, I was just going to kind of frame this in terms of, so what does this all mean going forward? We have these grants, we have housing needs analysis, housing production strategy, and economic opportunity analysis. These are foundational to the comprehensive plan and transportation system plans that are going to start at the end of January. We have a kickoff meeting for the comprehensive plan and transportation system plan with our consultants. So these really will help informing the chapters of the comprehensive plan. That would include housing element, which is for residential, and the economic element for employment. And there is an anticipated urban growth boundary expansion with the housing needs and economic opportunity analysis that have included an analysis of buildable lands within the city, and both are short. Housing acreage and employment acreage are both short. So if, in order to do an urban growth boundary expansion, there is a need to do an assessment of not only what your housing needs are, but what's called efficiency measures, which address issues like housing and are we maximizing our ability to actually develop housing in the city before the state will grant an urban growth boundary expansion. So there are the housing production strategies that we'll get into in a moment here. Those strategies, some of those will end up becoming included before the comprehensive plan is adopted. There'll be strategies that will be addressed that the state will require us to address. They're not saying which of those we're required to address, but they're asking that we do some efficiency measures to basically prove out that we actually need to do an urban growth boundary expansion. Even with those efficiency measures, our consultants and our staff believe we will still need an urban growth boundary expansion. It's on a scale that's beyond, it's not a small metric, it's a large metric. So the comprehensive plan timeline is estimated to go from January 2023 to December of 2024. There'll be an urban growth boundary expansion going on. Beyond that, there'll be a comprehensive plan initiation process. There'll be an urban growth boundary initiation process that will be started, and then there'll be an actual application for urban growth boundary expansion after the comprehensive plan is adopted. That would be both by the council and by Clackamas County Board of County Commissioners. And then from there, that would go into the urban growth boundary expansion process through the Department of Land Conservation and Development. That's a 120-day process. So all in, if everything goes smoothly, and we have no appeals, and Department of Land Conservation and Development does not forward this to the Department of Land Conservation and Development does not forward this to Land Conservation and Development, which is another agency at the state, for further consideration. Roughly spring of 2025 would be when the urban growth boundary expansion would be official in terms of the boundary itself. So the major, I'm going to now refocus on the housing piece of this and the employment part of this and kind of the major findings, kind of like where are we starting from and what are we trying to achieve here? So there's roughly about 6,000 residents, additional residents that are forecasted within the next 20 years within the city. And about 2,300 housing units is what that would require over the next 20 years. And the projections that we're using are based on the last 2010 to 2022. We're looking at the percentages of housing by type, and that was forecasted. And I have graphics that will show that, but just formulaic, just so you understand. That's based on basically what has happened over the last 12 years, so that's forecasted going forward. So with that, there would be an urban growth boundary expansion for housing of approximately 201 acres. That's beyond the current city urban growth boundary. Yes.
Would you like for us to ask questions?
Yeah, no, this is perfect, Dan. Commissioner Eward, yes.
So the additional 201 acres that you're talking about in bullet point 3 there, is that over and above what we already have in play?
It's outside the current urban growth boundary. It's in addition to the current, it's beyond, yes, to answer you.
Okay. All right.
And is this just housing? What about industrial and commercial?
I've got several slides to get through before we get to that next level, but yes, and so I will get beginning to employment. So this is just residential first on this. So one of the findings is a variety of housing types will be needed based on historical trends to provide more affordable housing options. And some strategies, like I said, would need to be adopted prior to the comprehensive plan. And maybe some of the highlights here and this is going to be fully just explained in the housing production strategy documentation. But I'm going to go through a few of these. So the demographics that were evaluated identified 17% of Canby renters spending over 50% of their income on rent. So 17%, which is extreme. It's considered an extreme rent burden. And over 50% of Canby renters were spending greater than 30% of their incomes. 30% is kind of a line in the sand for affordability. And so that's one of the things that came out of this. In terms of some other metrics, going forward, and these are market rate apartments. So 434 residential apartment rate multifamily units would be needed over 20 years. And that would be assuming about $1,600 a month for rent. Another statistic is just the price of housing for single-family detached homes. And this is based on 2019 information, but it's probably gotten worse actually over the last few years. But the median family income in Canby was $80,484. That could afford a mortgage of $410,000 or about $1,900 a month. The median home price now is $560,000. So there's a gap as well in the range here from renting to buying traditional homes. And I think the cost of homes have exacerbated. And so there's a need to look at this globally based on, again, historical trends and what we do know in terms of what population will likely need housing throughout the city.
So you bring, I get what you're saying as far as that, but how are we supposed to affect that? I mean, if the median price is, what was it, 516,000, something in that nature, and people are need to be at the 400 and some thousand minimum to make it. How do we, I mean, it's the builders that build this stuff, so
It's really, there are some limits to what the city can do, but what the city has the ability to do is to look at what kind of zoning would be in place, what kind of development standards would be in place to allow, say, for example, smaller single-family homes detached on smaller lots, or a combination of planned unit development activities where you have a mix of housing or cottage development type of structures. So it's incentive-based really is, I mean, we don't control the market. The city does not control the market, fully acknowledge that. But what we do control is the ability to incentivize the market to look at those things and also look at how, the zoning, for example, the area on Special Area J on the north end of town, targeted even in the 1984 plan as having a mix of housing in that, but the zoning doesn't currently represent that. And there's a desire to have a greater mix, but that zoning doesn't allow that. That's out by Walnut Street Extension. So the idea would be behind that would be looking at what in terms of development and how that comes about is talking to developers and saying, the folks that want to develop that may be more interested in cottage type of developments, which would have open space and trails around it, but might have smaller lots within a common area. Not necessarily a condominium style, but something our current code doesn't even address. So a product type that is not even in our code. So if we don't have it in our code, there's going to be no incentive because no one's going to even be able to do it because it's not even allowed. So it's looking at those kinds of things, and maybe those are, smaller lots. They could be, those are detached as an example, but there could be detached and attached depending on what the developer wanted to do. But I think part of that is we've had a history of product types where you've had very exclusionary zones between single family zones and other areas not integrated, or the variety of those has not been looked at in terms of like common open areas, because our codes don't really address those. Like planned unit development and cottage development codes don't really exist now. So those would be ways of addressing that. So the three ways that I mentioned, one is looking at like future zoning for areas that are going to be brought into the that are in the urban growth boundary that are going to get brought in, future zoning for those. Looking at development standards for like cottages and planned unit developments that would incentivize that, would allow a mix of development types. And there's really no reason these can't be compatible with each other or adjacent to each other. I've seen really good examples of that even this weekend on, in an area which was, in a subdivision, not in Canby, but where things are integrated and they look great. They like all match up and they work well together. Smaller lots there was a triplex in there and some smaller lots and some larger lots. They all work together. Some of that has to really focus on the design elements here as well. There may not always be the great examples here in town. In fact, maybe there aren't some great examples where people are like, I really don't like smaller lots because of this, this, and this. But how do we overcome those elements by design and say, yeah, it actually can work and can be integrated and you can have a mix of prices within an existing subdivision?
can you define cottage, what a cottage?
So really, I mean, cottage could be something with, could be a single story or it could be a multi-story. I don't have an exact definition. I mean, they're generally probably units that are smaller than what probably not a 4,000 square foot home. That's probably more like what you're getting in the regular subdivisions that are detached. So I would say somewhere in the 2,000 range, on a smaller lot with common open space areas around it, but you own your own lot, versus a condominium, which is an attached situation. So that's kind of the cottage piece. And what I'd like to do is bring forward more information about different product types, because I think that would be helpful. I mean, I think this is an educational process here. And so part of that is working with developers. It's also like looking at what the city wants to be, what options do we want? I mean, part of this is as an elected official on planning commission recommendation towards that and getting public input. But I think part of that is, defining what it is that we would like to allow, I think would be important, and then looking at that based on what our demographics are, and trying to fulfill what we will have as need.
Okay, thank you.
I might be ignorant here.
Yeah.
So how do you know, so 6,000 residents over 20 years, you're assuming 200 acres. I mean, how do you come up with that figure if we don't really know what we're looking at yet?
And I have tables that are coming here that I'll give you the detail of that, but yeah. So, I mean, it's this kind of macro here, so I've got tables on the back that will show how that's broken down.
Is this flexible?
It's based on our historical growth, and it's based on densities that were calculated by our consultants that have been formulated and vetted by DLCD. So they're on board with a calculation.
But we're required to accept the 6,000 residents.
The 6,000 residents is basically from Portland State University, and yes, we are required to accept that. They are the official demographer for that. We have no choice in that discussion.
We don't own our town.
Well, I think part of that is it's unfortunate, but in Oregon, you don't get to choose low, medium, or high. Other states, you get to choose your demographic. In Oregon, you get what Portland State University has provided. I think there's some legislative discussion about that issue about looking at different demographic scenarios, but that has not come to fruition.
So we got to make this work in 200 acres, basically.
Yes, that's true. I mean, and again, my 2 cents of this whole thing is Oregon is a very conservative state for urban growth boundary expansions. Every step of this process is conservative. It doesn't include market factors, which other states include. It doesn't look at supply as a factor for cost as much as it should, in my opinion. But it is what it is. And if you go outside of what's called safe harbor, which essentially is where DLCD will support you based on the demographics, you have extreme risk, and you're probably going to be in lawsuits with 1,000 Friends of Oregon for many, many years and never accomplish anything except for spending a lot of money in that process. So there's some legislative fixes that are needed. The legislature, I think, for maybe they're starting to really refocus on that and say, yeah, supply actually is part of that. And I think the housing crisis has caused them to look at supply. I think part of it is the state voted in the whole growth limitation situation, and farming is an important aspect, and I don't want to diminish that, but it creates really challenges for cities that need to grow. And that's actually a pretty big number compared to some other cities I've seen that, are similar sized. So I'm not saying that number is right or not, but it's right based on the 6,000 residents and the demographical analysis that our consultants have done for that. There's certain things we can't change, and the 6,000 is, we can't change that.
So my question, just to follow up on what Mr. Commissioner Llewellyn said here. So the 6,000 residents, that's if we want to expand our UGB, is that correct? Or is that, we got to handle that no matter what?
The 6,000 residents, so then you have, what the safe harbor is 2.7 persons per household is what the projection is, and there's more math I have in the slides that are forthcoming. But yes, that 6,000 residents equates to the need. And then it's also like what's available with the buildable lands analysis, which is the mapping exercise that goes through and looks at committed lands that are committed and already developed versus those that are not. So the end of the day discussion, and that 201, I mean, I guess I wouldn't say that's locked in for 20 years. We're doing a 20-year plan, but these typically are retested, and you typically update your comp plan every 8 to 10 years. This is a pretty big gulp in terms of like this process because it hasn't been done since 1984. So we're now like 38 years later and looking at that.
So have they already, we might be jumping ahead here, but have they already identified then? If they know we can do 6,000 houses and 200 acres, have they identified those acres already?
Those acres have not been identified, and I did not bring the map, but the Metro map, which shows areas that are not in reserve, are available. There is quite a substantial area around the city. That's part of the comprehensive plan process. This is just the need, and so part of the comprehensive plan process is going to be looking at, can we actually achieve all the acreage that's needed? I'm going to jump ahead slightly, but the industrials, the medium forecast for the industrial is 464.
Yeah, it is.
So, yeah, so that's, and again, that's looking at the metro map, and, there's all the areas in white. I mean, I should have probably brought that slide, but all the areas in white that are outside of the city that are not reserved are available. So this comprehensive plan update process, it will probably take in a large amount of that area that is available. We've not gone through and done a calculation. This is the needs-based piece of this is based on the housing needs assessment and the economic opportunity analysis. That's the need. Then the question is there acreage available? Are there willing property owners that want to participate in this process? Can we afford to serve the area with roads and transportation and utilities? All this stuff has to be in the mix. So at the end of the day, that number may be less, which would mean we probably would need to revisit that sooner than later. So we wouldn't be waiting another 20 years, obviously. We'd be coming back in 8 to 10 years to reassess that. My goal would be to do an economy of scale to the point, obviously that everything matches up. And some of this is policy level as well with citizen input but to get the best bang for our buck in terms of this process.
So what happens if we don't get the 201 acres committed? Does that mean the 6,000 comes down?
No, it just means that we don't have the land available essentially for the forecast, and I think that would be. I think that we will get to the 201. Here's where I would say that goes. I don't think we're going to get into that scenario. What that might mean is we aren't going to get as much industrial. That would be probably more the likely scenario. The state pretty much says you have to find it. You have to find the acreage. Now, and I think we have it available. So I would say that on the residential side, it will not be so much that. It might be more on the employment side that starts to reduce.
That's the one we need.
The employment side, ironically, though, is the one that they're not mandating. That's really more about what we want it to be.
But we needed to offset the tax base. I just want to be clear on that with people because they do not understand that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a balance. It's totally a balance. But yeah, so we're going to need to achieve the acreage, I mean, that's really it for residential. And then the employment, again, is based on the forecast that the employment that we've had in the past. So let me advance because you guys are really kind of jumping ahead, and that's okay. No, it's no worries. So So I was just going to, again, kind of jumping ahead. So where we have an advisory committee for housing and also for employment. For employment, the advisory committee was recommending the medium forecast, which is 464 acres is what that meant in terms of the job creation part of that. These are, again, the Planning Commission hearings that are up and coming, and this is partly why I'm doing this, because there's a lot to this, and when you guys get the reports, it'll hopefully help to expedite this. We may end up having other hearing items on that same night as well, so this is a twofer for me this may seem like I'm repeating a broken record here, but I'm just hoping this actually takes less time when we get to the point of actually going through those hearings. So then just kind of what our focus is for the Planning Commission, housing production and housing production strategies and the employment forecast. Those are, that's really what we're looking at. And I was going to dive into, before, maybe I'll just advance here because because I know you guys are interested in the demographics. So, this is one of the graphics here that talks about the population that's forecasted. So we're about at 24,586 in 2043, and that's the horizon. And then this next slide goes into the breakdown of what historically, if you look on the left side, you have single family, townhomes and plexes, multifamily and manufactured homes. That's the current mix that we've had over the last 12 years. And that's forecasted across in terms of housing units based on 2.7 persons per household, which is what the state again has used as what they call safe harbor. And then the next slide kind of gets to the conclusionary piece of this, which is There's a lot of numbers here, but you've got gross buildable lands and then you got net buildable lands, and the end result is that there's 201 acres less than what we would need to basically accommodate 6,000 people. Based on that, it ends up being about 2,300 units, 2.7 units per acre is what essentially gets to the 6,000. So I thought that might be helpful. And again, you'll have a lot more time when we get to the whole process of like going through this. And if you have questions about the demographics tonight, I'm happy to bring those forward. But what I'm just trying to do is basically, address like the high level stuff so you understand that. And if there's questions that you have that I need to bring back to provide detail, I'm happy to do so. So I'm going to jump back to the housing. So these are strategies for the affordability. Commissioner Ewert was asking about what can we control and what we can't control in terms of things. And there's a whole large list of these strategies that the state provides. Our advisory committee came up with these with our consulting staff and planning staff. And I just wanted to go through this kind of quickly, and there could be others added to this or focused in a slightly different direction. But the first one, which is A, develop criteria and process for identifying land to upzone for middle housing. Again, this might be areas like Special Area J, where we're looking at more of a mix out there that would be in the upzone category. This should be part of the comprehensive plan process.
So when you're talking about upzoning, you're not like going, because, you know, R15 is still frequently we have zones like that, but they end up looking like R1 zones. So are you talking about like going in from R1 to 2 or 1.5 to 2 or?
At the end of the day, two things are going to have to happen. One is, to answer your question, I think we need to look at vacant areas within the urban growth boundary that are not part of the city now, and are those appropriate in terms of what the zoning is of those lands? That's the first lens. Second lens is lands that will come in that are not in the city now. And I'd say for the ones that are within the urban growth boundary now, looking at the category of zoning, there could be a new zone. There might be a zone that is missing within our three zones, our R1, R15, and R2. Maybe there's a zone that splits between R15 and R2 that's a different category. So that would be part of that analysis is, you know, would the zoning by itself do that, or would there be other tools, which again, going back to be on cottage clusters and R zones, that's something that likely will be something that we'll have to address earlier than before the comp plan adoption. That'll be something that's part of our efficiency measures. That's a possibility. That's one of the items that we might need to address.
And those are as distinct from ADUs?
They would be, yes. They would not consider it. They would not be. ADUs would still remain. People would still be able to do accessory dwelling units. That's still on the books. We have that in our code right now. But these would be more like clustering of houses around a common amenity, open space, trails, et cetera. That's typically what these are, is when you get into clusters. They have specific design standards with them, and they look a certain way, and there's some continuity to those. The other one that is a possibility of being looked at further before the comp plan is the plan unit developments. That would be C and D, and looking at ways of modifying our code to make for a variety of housing types within current zones. So you've got your current zone, but you could have a plan unit development that may end up having a different mix that's allowed under certain circumstances with criteria. And that's something else that could be looked at. And then modifying system development charges, that's going to have to come out of the comprehensive plan process. We're going to do the system development charge updates anyway, but that's going to have to wait until we get through that process to do that. The next item is updating housing needs periodically. That's something that would be post-comprehensive plan, but, basically the monitoring and to the point about how do we make sure we have enough land base, that's absolutely periodic check-ins, and I'm not sure how much we've done that in the past, but I think that's an important thing is these milestones. How are we doing? How are we doing on consumption? Were the numbers correct, or did we massively exceed those numbers, or are we under them? And then G, periodic review of barriers to new development, and I would say that's going to be part of our overall code update after our comprehensive plan. We do need to update our entire code, but those barriers to development are something we probably should be assessing on all zones, and that would be something that might be able to be overcome with other things like cottage development and planned unit development standards. But there may be barriers that we want to look at to remove things that are obstructions to more affordable housing in terms of not necessarily density, but there's just sometimes there's things in the code where there's really no room without getting a full-blown variance for things. H is land use permitting education of property owners and developers. That would be really, again, post the comprehensive plan. And then I is amend the commercial zoning to allow mixed housing development. And this should be primarily probably along corridors like 99. The downtown allows mixed use in the C1, but other commercial zones don't allow mix of where you have commercial on the bottom and housing on the top. That seems maybe a stretch that people at this point would live along those corridors, but over the life of a 20-year plan, maybe something more lucrative. Things change. You could have a whole bunch of different restaurants and brew pubs and those kinds of things, and things happen, and it becomes more attractive to residential along corridors. So those may be new developments. They may not be using, they may not be reused so much as new developments along like 99. That would be one of those items, and that could happen before the comprehensive plan was adopted. So these are just, again, these are things that are part of the process of trying to address the demographical needs of the community. So the next thing, I am going to shift into employment. And the medium growth scenario, again, was what the advisory committee, economic advisory committee came up with. And that does reflect the growth that we've seen over the 2009 to 2020 horizon. And this is where the 464 acres came into play in terms of what's needed for growth, continued growth that would maintain that medium growth. There was also a low end, which is lower than the growth rate, and a high end, a high growth rate, which was beyond the medium. And so the objectives for the employment, and these are things that are part of this process, that these are the broad ones: enhance Canby's positive business environment with adequate commercial, industrial, mixed-use sites to address future growth opportunities. These came again from the advisory committee. Plan for industrial expansion areas east and north of Bolino Road. Retain and attract businesses that provide high-quality jobs with high levels of employment per acre. Provide incentives for targeted job creation and major private investment. Support expansion in health services. Support workforce training and development. Expand opportunities for the development of workforce housing. Expand lodging options. Fund roads and infrastructure using innovative techniques. Support arts and visitation, including agri and business tourism, agri and bicycle tourism. Attract downtown redevelopment with integrated mixed-use buildings. Update design standards and provide incentives for building renovations. So these are some items, and this, when we get to these, and this is just kind of a preview for, when we get, I want you to think about these, but when we get to the hearing, these are the kind of items that we would like your input on, as well as the housing production strategies. So if you had thoughts on those, I'm just kind of, your role in this. I know you're making a recommendation to council, but I would like your input on both the strategies for housing and also for employment on objectives. So the anticipated schedule, just kind of going through that with you tomorrow night. Again, there'll be a public meeting here in this chambers. It'll go through a little more in detail. I'm kind of covering, you're going to hear some repeated information, but there'll be some more detail to update that. There'll also be a public survey that will be sent out, which will be, I believe, issued on January 30th or 31st, and it will be closing, I believe, on February 15th. That's to get public input on where we're at to date in the current both housing strategies and objectives that I just pointed out. So to get people's input on those as part of that. And then that will go back to the Housing Advisory Committee on the 22nd, which is their final meeting for that. And there'll be more discussion around that. There'll be also a joint work session, Planning Commission and City Council. You're going to hear a lot of the same information I'm presenting now, but there'll be more about public input on that and what the public has weighed in on. And then again, March 13th, housing production strategy. That'll go to the Planning Commission on March 13th, and then to the Council on April 19th. And then the economic opportunity analysis would be March 27th, and going to Council on May 3rd. So I did go through these slides here, and I do have some employment slides as well, or at least this one, which is a breakdown of the acreage that, and you can see the low, medium, and high forecasts that are part of that. Low being, and this is commercial and industrial, 103, medium being 464, and high being 510. And again, these are big numbers, but they're for 20 years, and we're running out of a large amount of our employment land. I mean, there's just, one of the observations I had when I started was that we're running out of both housing and employment, and that was more of a qualitative basis, but it's played out with the demographics. So with that, I'm kind of to discussions, questions, and we can bring back more information. I'd be happy to use this platform, since we didn't have any hearings, not just trying to fill things, but actually try to help in, again, the discussion. So this is not like so much information that you're overwhelmed with what it is. And hopefully this is helpful in characterizing what we're trying to achieve.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
And again, my ignorance here. So Portland State's the one that did this study. So do you guys work closely with them? Do they seek your input on this?
Portland State University has been, for the entire metro area, I'm not sure for how long, they are the demographers for the area, and the state has recognized them as the demographic demographers for the state. There really is no debate about their numbers. Everybody in the entire metro area is using their numbers. But like I said, the legislature, I think, is looking at other considerations about not just having a singular number, but looking at more the low, medium, high forecast, where you could say, no, actually, we don't want just one number. We want to be able to pick what that is. Or that there's some more latitude in terms of how that, who does that? Does the state take that back and take that role on? It's a little odd that PSU is in that role. I'm not sure what the history is of that. But I think there's some discussion about the state taking that active role in terms of being the demographers for the state. So we don't really have any control over that. That's not something we have any say really in, essentially. I mean, it's not something we can modify or argue, no, your numbers are wrong. It's pretty much, this is the number where you guys need to use.
Well, the last time they did the industrial park, it went to 3 different colleges at 3 different times. It came to the same result, and we still fought those. But so, when do you guys get into the design phase of this? I mean, when do you kind of start determining where that land's going to be? Are you already doing that?
That will be in the comprehensive plan process. So the comprehensive plan is going to start in January. The first 6 months is going to go through the end of June. That's the first piece of this. That's going to set out level of service issues and discussions around things that we need to, the formula of where are we going forward with roads and infrastructure. That's going to be that piece of discussion. And then the next round, which is going to be July 1 to June 30th, 23-24, as part of that cycle, there'll be what's called scenario planning. And those scenarios will look at those things like growth boundaries and where those properties are that would be potentially in the urban growth boundary expansion area. And then the other part of it is how do we serve them? It's not just showing that we need that, but how do we serve them, and what does that look like? How does that play out in terms of who provides those services, and what's the role of the city versus the private developer? Those are the things that'll be in that scenario planning. So it's probably more in the middle of that 23, 24 is my belief, than at the beginning of that, because there's quite a bit of work to be done to get to that point. And that'll start to identify those areas that are needed to be expanded into. Soils analysis will be part of that, obviously, and I'm sure that's not something you're unfamiliar with, but the whole process of doing that, and then also, willing participants is important as well, versus forcing somebody to go into the city, which I think that would be problematic. So we're looking for really more willing participants.
And I guess from my experience, I would like to see the city be more proactive with these property owners. I don't want anybody to be in this position we were, where this was done and then 20 years later it happened and we had to prove that it was actually the city's industrial park. That wasn't fun. So, I want to make sure we got all those property owners so they know exactly what's going on right away. And go knock on their doors. Don't just put something in the newspaper. Or say you're going to mail something to somebody and then they never got it, which happened to all of us out there initially.
And I 100% support and agree with anytime you're doing changes to somebody else's property, their input is quite critical to that process. I think it's because it becomes a discussion about what is it going to be, what zoning is that going to be, what development standards is that going to be, what is the relationship with the city. All those are huge.
Yeah, they need to completely understand the urban growth boundary versus the city limits, because it's a big deal. And what's that mechanism that they'll be able to come in without a fight? Because that, 20 years from now, will be a whole different group of people. We might all be dead, who knows? But then nobody knows what's going on.
And there'll be a large outreach, and I agree with you 100%. That's from my perspective. I don't want somebody to be surprised. And that's not good planning. So, I think that's part of it. I think there's a large amount of review before we get to the point of like individually contacting property owners. But I think that framework has to be set up so that we're going through this process, and it's not only educational, but then we get to the point of saying, okay, these look like they may be potential, and those lines may shift based on whatever we find out. Some of this is a little bit, even the ag land piece is going to be a little tricky, because the LCD is not going to be as favorable for large chunks of property that are viable agricultural lands. They just aren't. So how parcelized is it? What does that look like? And what's it adjacent to? And so there's a whole evaluation that needs to happen as well.
Did you have some?
So we're talking about this. Where does as far as infrastructure, water, sewer, electric, all of that is going to play a huge piece into this. Have those folks already started this process? And if so, how far down the road are they, and are they accepting to this? Can we even do it? Because we can't do anything that you just talked about if we can't flush our toilets and drink our water. So
yeah, they're aware. The evaluation, for an expansion, obviously for the areas in the urban growth boundary now, those are servable. They're, those are all part of the plan. We've had conversations, for example, with Canby Utility. They're doing a water system update for their master plan. They know there's the likelihood of an expansion. They're going to be looking at that as well. So some of this is, there's an awareness, but you're correct. The evaluation of that has to be evaluated as well. And so there's many, many pieces to this thing. This is first of all, what is your need? Secondly, on a pragmatic standpoint, can you serve it? Third, is there willing participation by the property owner? fourth, maybe the soil issue and the agricultural viability of the property. And then there's just, obviously the public has a role in this as well, because it's, the citizenry here needs to be involved with that. And these are not necessarily ranked in terms of order, but all those things play into this for that discussion.
To play off Commissioner Ewert, one of the biggest battles we had in the first industrial park was approving that master plan, and nobody thought about the financing part of it. And part of this, doing this, when we're expanding that comprehensive land use plan, those folks out there need to know how this is all going to get paid for, the water, the sewer, how's that going to get to them? That needs to be discussed right now with the property owners in the room. And, what do you expect of them? It takes money to annex.
Absolutely. Well, and system development charges are, it's, that role of that versus, who puts it in. And obviously the city has a pretty significant stake in this as well, which gets into a capital facilities plan, which are part of that update process as well. I mean, so I think that all is part of this. I think, there are a number of steps before we start launching into what this will exactly look like. It's really easy to go there, but there's many steps before we get to that point. And I think there will be a little bit of necessity for some patience here as we go through and peel this back. But all those absolutely are all important.
Do the battles now, because there will be battles.
Yeah.
Get them done now.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, I'm not suggesting that we defer those, but there are things, baseline information pieces that we need to start out with that our council needs to be involved with in terms of, looking at those things that you guys brought up before we start presenting those to property owners. That's essentially it. I mean, you're right. I mean, that's something that if we have concerns with that, we shouldn't be way down the tracks and then, oh, by the way, you guys are like, you're going to pay for everything. I mean, that's not a good relationship in that situation.
And just one other thing that comes to mind too is when they looked at that industrial park, and I think back then nobody ever thought this was ever going to happen. It was a completely different world. But we need to look at this at 30,000 feet wherever we're going. I mean, the fact that they put that land in the industrial park and never looked at Walnut to 99E or First Avenue to 99E as part of that is beyond ridiculous to this day. And what a cluster you ended up in that whole scenario. It's like, we really need to look at this thing at 30,000 feet, wherever that property is going to be, and be sure it makes sense, for growth, because, why they didn't bring that other property at the same time to connect it to 99E, and the battles and the anger that's gone on here has been crazy over the years. Really unnecessary.
Yeah, and I can't speak to what happened previously, but my hope is that there's not these huge elements that were missed, in this process. There may need to be things like, framework plans that are put together for some of these areas that might, or whatever you want to call it, framework or sub-area plans for these areas to, part of this is trying to get through the state system is not easy by itself. And then obviously the property owners have a huge stake in this as well. So that's the balance of all these things kind of moving forward. And it's, you have to peel them back as you go through that process. But everything you guys have said is on mark.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that, of course, I think that when we did the industrial park, we were just glad to get the industrial park put together. It was like, yeah, we had no idea what, it was the first shovel-ready dirt that was outside of Metro, really, that was available. So we were just glad to get the process done. We had no idea that Columbia Distributing were going to come in. We were going to be so popular, I guess, is the thing. And we were looking at smaller type situations. So, but that being said, you've given us some really, really good information, and what you've done is you've kind of brought the elephant into the room. What's the best way for us to move forward and eat this thing?
And I would go back, let me go back to the schedule here, because I think this is not the only touch point.
Could we pause just for a second?
Yeah, yeah.
We haven't heard from Commissioner Jarosh
absolutely.
at all,
Yes,
and I
yeah.
just want to make sure I'm not missing any cue. Commissioner Jarosh, are you wanting to ask any questions or chime in at all here?
Thanks for doing that. Yeah, usually I'm pretty good at waving my hands and somebody notices, but thanks. I do just have a couple things. I don't have a lot because I think most of you know that I've been involved in this in great detail since this started, and I've been on, it's kind of a working committee, and so I've been through a number of the meetings, and I went to the open house, and Commissioner Ewert was at the open house, which was very, very interesting and informative. So a lot of this information, most of it I've seen, and I've had the chance to absorb it, so thank you for continuing to put this together for us. We really appreciate that, Don. It's a lot to, communicate and a lot to absorb. But one thing I did mention, I think it was after the last open house, is there is a big gap, and I think you, probably some of you have experienced it, between what the citizens are feeling and what is being presented. And some of that's just, they're in this massive disbelief, we got to stop growing. We've got to stop growing. I mean, I hear that at the grocery store. I see that on Facebook. I heard a lot of that in the open house. And have we as a city, this has nothing to do with the planning department, but have we as a city budgeted for any kind of a company that can help us with, presenting this in a way that is, I don't know, more palatable for citizens? Like, somebody that does this for a living. Like if you look at what Newburgh did and what McMinnville did, they named the process, they got a logo for it. So anytime the citizens saw something with that logo on it, they knew it was about this process. And so they hired a PR company to help to close that gap. I think it's really hard when you get like what I saw in the open house, which was great, but consultants talking to citizens, I don't think works very well. And I don't know if we're doing anything about closing that gap.
Commissioner,
Not the planning department, but the city.
no, Commissioner Jarosh, your great comments. There will be a full branding process for the comprehensive plan, really robust outreach process for the comprehensive plan, which includes the transportation system plan. So that absolutely is the situation. I think part of it is, it's really difficult for people to not jump ahead and say, where does this apply on this particular piece of property in the city, and have that instantaneous information.
Is the city going to hire somebody to help with that, or are they going to try to do that PR part on their own?
No, that's part of our comprehensive plan contract, Commissioner Jarosh, that they're part of that already. So 3J Consulting is leading that effort, and they are public outreach folks that do that. I've worked with them both here in the city and as a consultant. I worked with them previously, so they're very good at what they do. I think that piece can't be understated. I think it's really easy for people to, be emotional about this, and I get it. I think part of that is trying to make sure people understand that planning is to guide future growth. It's really not really necessarily intended to promote as much as it is to guide. And I think that's because the growth is going to be there. And that messaging is really critical. And it's also to realize that we have demographical information as part of these assessments, and we have to take action on those items. I mean, that's just part of our process here that we have to move forward with. And so I think hoping that more outreach and robust outreach in the future, including the newspaper and other media sources and surveys, there'll be multiple surveys sent out electronically. So at the end of the day, there should be no one really that comes to a hearing that's like, I didn't know what was going on, which is what you hear a lot. So that's the goal of this whole process, is to do that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the last open house was a big eye opener for me, and I appreciated it. So it was just a lot of commentary that I hadn't heard before. So thank you very much. I'm done now. Thanks.
So to play on that, on that outreach like that, it's important that to really highlight the education of this, this isn't something the city of Canby necessarily wants to do, but there's state and federal laws that say that you can't stop people from moving to your town. And people don't understand that it's people that create growth, not businesses. They do not understand that. And they don't understand the offsetting tax base. And I think that needs to be front and center. Go talk to your feds and state, if you don't like it. I mean, I don't like some of the stuff that's going on now either. But you have to deal with it. And you can't stop people from coming here, and it's people that create growth. And that just needs to be brought home, because that's the fight we had for years. And bad decisions got made because of that, trying to stop that. They thought the stopping businesses was going to stop growth. And this town, it could have been a totally different looking town if that fight had been, if that thought process had been changed, and if people were educated, it would have been a totally different thought process. And I just can't underscore this enough. The very theme should be, it's people that create growth, not businesses. If we don't have those businesses, your taxes are going to go through the roof.
Well, part of the issue, I think, is that the people who wanted the industrial park to come into existence aren't necessarily the people who are suffering from it, I can think of myself as how what I wanted out of a community when I was 20 is a lot different than what I want out of a community now. And the dangers that we're facing is by only looking at what it is we want out of a community, we're essentially aging our community with our decisions. And that's one of the things that I'm, having worked in the schools for a long time, and when Don brings it up, it's the reality we lived with, is that, Canby has grown, but our school enrollment has been flat as a pancake for a couple of decades. And part of it is that we just haven't grown all parts of our housing similarly, and, by just letting developers choose what's the most profitable for them to build without, can be putting any limits on it, has kind of gotten us to where we are now. But when the decisions were being made, from what I hear, the industrial park sat for a long time before there was interest, and they essentially had to run out of land in other places. And then all of a sudden, hey, look down there. And, here they came. And so, the people, it's not just that there's different people, but the people have changed as the kind of people they are as we've aged. And these are all kind of things that we have to fight a little bit, and drag ourselves out of our shell and, think about what we were looking for when we were, 23, 26, and trying to get a family started.
Just to back up here for a little education, that industrial park, Milgard wanted to come in there years ago, and they were set to come in. And the fight that ensued on there to stop growth, and that's all that was about, is to stop growth. When that happened, you sent this incredible message out to the entire business community, not only in Portland, but all around the world, frankly. These guys are all talking to everybody. That's why that park sat empty. I lived it. Okay. So if you want a park and you need it for your tax base, you can't disown it, right? And that's what happened. And so that's why that park sat empty. In the year 2000, if Milgard would have come in, and we had put that group of property owners together, and this is important. You want your property owners in sync with you. We had to raise a bunch of money to fight this, just to get the owners, just get the town to take ownership of this park. That's not what you want. It sends a very bad message to your business, to your developers. We want to control this. And that's what we were trying to do, is trying to bring all that property in with those property owners together, working with the city. You want to control your growth. But when you have people out there that think by stopping that will stop growth, you're making this worse. That's why we're in the predicament we're in now. This would have looked totally different had Milgard come in. I'm telling you, it would look totally different, because the business community would have been right behind them.
Don, is changing the zoning, is that more of a legislative process, or is it more of a judiciary process? Because we're more on the judiciary side, right?
It's going to be legislative. There will be, I mean.
Recommendations? I'm
Exactly. The
assuming?
planning commission is going to be used as a vetting
Okay.
body, which I think is appropriate. And part of that is that ultimately where this all goes back full circle is the origin of this is going to be this discussion, but then full front and center will be code updates that you will see that will be dealing with housing, whether it's a cottage ordinance, planned unit development ordinance, whatever that is, whatever that looks like, this body will be reviewing those as well, and making a recommendation to council. So I think even though a lot of this is legislative, the steps in this is really, planning commission, and then ultimately you're the implementers, because then the development comes in and then you're the body that reviews that. So you may see the full cycle from the legislative kind of high level comp plan to the code, to the project, and actually reviewing the code based on the project.
So where would that rezoning recommendation and/or adoption process fit in here? Because I'm assuming that, I think we've got some chicken versus egg possibilities with all the different things you could do, and all of them are equally important. But if I'm a property owner and I want to know what the possibility is of utilizing my land, and I would need to know that the zoning potential exists, right? So would we be addressing zoning kind of early in the process?
It's not going to be so early, that the zoning piece it'll be probably 23, 24 fiscal year. I mean, that's more probably towards the end of that is my guess. But that's probably where that will come into play as to where those lines are. And if it doesn't get covered there, it will be at the beginning of 24, 25, which will take us through the end of December 24. So that's where, I don't know exactly where the line in the sand is going to be, but for sure we will cover some of that in 23, 24. So there's a while before we even get to that point about, and I think we'd be looking at areas primarily that are not already annexed, or, those would be probably more likely the scenarios, or areas that would be brought into the city. What appropriate zoning would that be? What is it that, going back to the tax base, targeted, and this gets into the development standards, which is what are we targeting, for the tax base, which is a huge part of the balance here, is how big the lot is and what the parameters are has some degree to what you're going to end up on those lots, in terms of what we're targeting. So that's another discussion as well, which will get into code about, possibly modifications to industrial codes, or maybe a different industrial standard, or maybe it's the same industrial standard, maybe it's light industrial, maybe it's identical, but those are part of that discussion as well. So that's where that piece comes in. And I think what we're going to see is the annexation process, and I think part of that is really, it's going to be, the comprehensive plan is going to be the designated piece that we will address in the comp plan. We've done, unless we restructure this, zoning really comes in with annexation. So you basically, where we would stop as a city, unless that gets changed, would be we'd be designating these things comp plan wise. And then if they got brought into the UGB, then, they obviously would then could go through that process, do an annexation and rezone at the same time with a development concept plan, which is how we've done all those. So there's some steps here before we'll actually see that, on the ground. But I think part of that is, that's way down the path. The near term is more these efficiency measures that you will see back, and that's going to be really kind of more near term. On March 13th, you're going to see, that was a question about where do we fit in. You'll be seeing the recommendations on, these are the efficiency measures that we would like to move forward with as part of the housing production strategy process, and those would end up moving into code changes that you will see before the comp plan is updated. That those would have to be adopted before June 2024. They have to be adopted. It's not that far out. No. I mean, it seems like it's a long ways out, but it's not that far out. And so that would end up involving you folks as part of that process to what those code changes are, whether it's cottage or planned unit development, those kinds of things would come back before this body.
And just to clarify too, before we move on with the slides, so I myself have only lived here less than 5 years, but the majority of this body has got some pretty rich history and a lot of experience and knowledge to draw on. So we have the ability, you said, there'll be a work session with City Council where we can advance maybe some of these thoughts and
On March 1st, yeah,
okay.
absolutely. And that would be the next, really the main milestone that I would like, that would be, because we'll be at a finer level of detail. We'll have the public open house over, we'll have the final housing committee over,
Yeah.
we'll have the survey information coming in from the community, those will be reported out. And then that March 1st joint work session is an important milestone for you. Yeah, that would be it. And that kind of sets the stage for the planning commission. I mean, this is really kind of hard to digest all these pieces, and that's another reason I'm doing this, like, kind of monologue on these
way appreciated.
work sessions. Because I mean, there's a lot to this, and hopefully if it's confusing, let me know, because it's a long process with steps, but they're all lock key steps.
Well, and just to keep us reminded of what is in our lane and what is not. We're a semi or quasi judicial commission, and policy and legislative stuff is up at the council level, but it's easy to cross over real quick with what we want to see and how we want to see things influenced. But
this is a recommending body, but I do value the input. I value the history. And I think it's important because ultimately you'll be implementers. So that's not always an opportunity that I've seen in every jurisdiction, where sometimes it's like, here's your new code. And they're like, where did this come from?
Yep.
I mean, I would rather not have that, because that's just going to cause all kinds of problems.
Yep.
Like, I have no idea what this means, so.
I think this is you did a great job here. I think it's a great start.
Good.
I appreciate
Thank you.
what you did.
And kind of like moving forward, I mean, there will likely be more work sessions we have, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here to the planning director piece, which we'll come back to. But I mean, I think in the near term, we have a bunch of stacked development review applications that are coming in. That's probably going to be March, April, May. Right now, we have some openings still in February, or actually March. The next few planning commission meetings, we don't really have anything. Until we get into March, we don't really have any development review applications. So that's, where we're at.
Okay. Which then kind of, this is where, what's the best use of our time? And
Fences and trees.
That's kind of where I'm going with this. Is
Yeah,
I feel like,
Yeah.
For this body, we talked a little bit offline about, half of this board is going to be, as soon as we seat the other two additional future commissioners, are going to be brand spanking new. And so is there an opportunity for the education piece and training that fits in there? But the whole, the meetings for the sake of meetings thing is like, I just loathe it.
No, and I hear you, and we've had that conversation.
Yes.
And I think that's not I want this to be value added. So you guys, value your time. It's actually helpful for me because, I mean, in some ways, to have to force me to put this together as PowerPoint makes it important to quantify it succinctly, so I'm not wandering. So you guys aren't wandering.
Yep.
So that is important to me. I would say that, the next, February, the next two two planning commission meetings, though I would, we've had some conversations. I can't guarantee you when fences are going to come back to Commissioner Hutchinson's, but we had that conversation as staff today, because I'd like the fences to come back. Trees, I think, are going to be part of the comp plan piece, which is going to be part of the environmental section of the comp plan, and that will get into the discussion around the, kind of environmental element that we have, which is a comprehensive plan chapter, which is about the environment, which fits in well with that. And then that sets up policy directive, which then sets up code and expectations around that.
Are you of the mindset of the adoption of the Honorable Mr. Ewart's process of present us with, let's say on fences, here's four recommendations, vote, yay or nay?
I would, yes, I 100% endorse that, and I don't want to spend a gazillion meetings. I can tell you about being on other boards that, advisory boards where we dealt with fencing, and people were so burned out by the time we got through it all. I mean, it was just, I understand. Yeah.
All right. So here, I'm all for planning, or I wouldn't be sitting here for as long as I've been sitting here. But I'm also all for moving forward. And so you guys deal with the builders, you deal with the stuff every day. And as far as the fences concerned, Ryan has done a great job of all of his different pictures and trying to educate us and whatnot. And I'm speaking for myself here, but I think that in a lot of these different things, we have a lot of things that need to be tweaked. You guys know this better than we know it. I think that any of these things, you guys should make a hit list of things that are important to you. And then whatever that thing is, and I'll use fences for example, just bring us what you think will work well, that'll get the job done in an A, B, and C fashion. And then we'll discuss it, and we'll give it a thumbs up or thumbs down. No matter what we choose, I believe as we go, as you guys go forward and you implement our choice, and you say, whoop, this isn't working right, you can bring it back to us, and we can tweak it and make it so that it's usable tool for you guys. And I think that really, rather than spending hours and hours and hours, I mean, I love fences, but I don't love them anymore because we've talked about them so much. And so I just think we just need to, for the lack of a better term, we just need to shoot that snake and kick it off in the ditch and move on to the next one. Yeah, because I think we got a lot of snakes to deal with.
And so noted, and it's more been bandwidth capacity than it is like Ryan spending hours and hours and hours on his free time, going over fences, but it's been more of a bandwidth thing. We're on the same page with this, of landing the plane, basically, another analogy to move that forward, because it is something that would be really beneficial to us, to the development community, so we're not in these ongoing battles with the developers who are battling us over fences, and we have continuity in decision-making processes. I mean, some of this, is a housing issue, to be honest with you. I mean, it comes down to, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. When I go into a neighborhood, I think about that. Like, these are smaller lots, and where's the fence located? And it's a whole dynamic that I think we didn't have to recognize in the past, because the lots were bigger. They were all oriented in the same direction. Everybody wanted to show off their front yard. They were set back from the road. That's not the paradigm that we're in now. I mean, that's not to lead you guys in any direction, but just to say that there's a recognition of some of that like it's changed. And so that thought process needs to be part of that. But yeah, bring it forward and make it simple, is that message has been received.
Okay, I'll stay.
Okay. So if there's nothing, Commissioner Jarosh may have something else on, I just wanted to get her input on one final thought on housing and economic analysis, and then we can jump into the other parts of the agenda.
I don't, I'm good. Thank you, Don.
Okay. So with that, it will close that part out. There will likely be more coming back to you, possibly even as early as February 13th for continuation of some of this dialogue as this continues forward. And hopefully this is helpful. And, let me know when you guys get completely tired of this topic. But I think there's a lot of things to peel back here, and you guys have provided really good input. So that's that next planning commission. So I'll just jump into that items of interest from the planning staff. And so our next February 13, I likely will have another presentation as we drill into this further, with the whole anticipation, again, helping you guys understand this better. So as we get stuff forwarded in front of you, and some of this will be rather quick order, even though we're not that far into 23, this year is stacked with all this stuff. I mean, you're going to be hearing a lot about it. Other things, I did give a brief presentation to council also on the tolling issue, ODOT tolling, just as a very thumbnail discussion on that. We've provided a letter to ODOT as part of their scoping process for their environmental assessment. So I think it was 4 or 5 pages of information of our concerns around that. That they received 4,500 comments during that process. Our focus is really on the I-205. This is kind of complicated because they're doing tolling amounts, and so there's these fragmented ways of the way this is set up, but ultimately it's leading to them writing an environmental assessment, which we will also comment on, but the environmental assessment should theoretically address our concerns, or at least try to mitigate for the impacts. It's an ongoing dialogue. ODOT, to their credit, has been here in August and December in this room talking about mitigation. The biggest concern, to be honest, is the funding source, and can the funding source, and can they actually afford to do the mitigation in an appropriate way? I mean, there's many issues with tolling, but can be specific. What is the impact going to be, and from the diversion, and can you mitigate it? That will be a part of the discussion you will hear in the comprehensive plan update as well, because that will weave into that based on level of service, which that'll be an input that was not anticipated into the system. So that's another piece that will be part of that discussion. And that, just to forewarn you, that's, other things coming on the horizon. So that, just to give you a sense of what that's about. So I don't know when the environmental assessment's going to be issued. It's supposed to be spring, I'm believing. We'll be commenting on that as well.
So when you say funding, are you talking about funding as far as mitigation issues outside of the tolling, or the tolling, I mean?
So let's say there's an impact to an intersection, are they able to afford to do things to improve that or alter it or even the one suggestions that they had about building a roundabout at Haynes Road. When will that be funded? When will it get built? Same South End Road is supposed to have a signal on it. And then Lone Elderberry Road is supposed to be reoriented on the south end of town to be more 90-degree angle versus where it's at. When is that going to happen? What is the timing, and what is the funding source? So we're not the only community that's having this issue. Oregon City is going through the same evaluation, same concerns. We're spending quite a bit of time talking to all the Clackamas County agencies. We're actually in discussions with them about their concerns as well. There's there's kind of a forum that's been set up because of this. And so it would be more those issues can be specific, even things like transit, like is there going to be delays in transit service? And would that increase the need for bus drivers? And would that increase the need for, more buses and more transit places to store buses, though. So those things, not to exaggerate the issue, but like, unless it's studied, we really don't know. And having the same equity lens for Canby area transit as TriMet, has that been looked at? Those are things that we're asking. So more to come. It's complicated. I mean, but just to let you know, and you guys won't necessarily be diving into that other than the comp plan, but when you, just pointing that out, that will circle back to some degree in that process.
So is the I-5 tolling, is this a done deal?
The 205, yes, it is. I mean, as far as we know, I mean, unless they withdraw that, I mean, the legislature has enacted it. They're talking about implementation in 2025. With the gantries.
And it's just 205 at this point?
205 initially, and then it'll be 5.
But the legislature, with the new legislature in session, does have the opportunity to kill the whole thing. If they're smart.
They have to start pulling highway funds out of the general fund, though, and nobody wants that.
Yeah.
We've backed ourselves into this weird corner with the gas tax, and that's the only place we're willing to get road funds from. So, it's either that or you just really got to cut open the whole road funding thing because of the electrification of the whole transit system.
Cut it open as far as I'm concerned.
So I'm not sure where this is all. I'm just kind of giving you input as we're trying to deal with this in live time and like all these inputs and, it's. Walnut Street Extension. Yeah, that one is one that's, speaking of ODOT, that does need an access permit. I believe it's super close to being, submitted to ODOT for that process. Funding is there, I believe, for the large part of that project. And so that is a priority. It needs to be pushed. That's about the best update I can give you. It is a priority.
Bringing that up, is it possible to go backwards a little bit and look at that whole area and look at all the roads over the years and have that discussion again I still think I'm in the consultants that we had years ago, connecting downtown to that industrial park. It's so vital to this town, and I'd really like to come back and have that discussion and look at the roads that were proposed, and why weren't they done? Were they done? Because Walnut was never on the radar, and I went through those meetings in the 90s. It was never on that radar to expand that.
The transportation system plan will be updated. It was 2010 the last time, and so that's part of the comp plan process. So that the road system and network as a whole will be evaluated. I'm not sure about the going back in history time frame, but obviously that's part of this whole process is like looking at the system as a whole. And so, yeah, there's an opportunity to
maybe not look back necessarily,
Yeah.
but what were those roads? How can we connect that? Because, and that was the only, by the way, that was the, I forget the name of the road. That was the road that was designed to go over the railroad tracks, connecting the park and everything together. And that needs to happen. Or this downtown will die again. The growth will go out east and north.
Good points. I think that the transportation system plan, and that's going to be more 23, 24 when we're getting into the deep dive on that. That's really when that focus is going to happen.
And we'll have opportunities to do joint sessions with city council to bring stuff, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like, really good points like that. How do we get to interact with city council on to help maybe advance that agenda.
And I
a
think
little
the joint sessions are a great avenue for that. I mean, part of this is you guys are the implementers in terms, as I see, they're kind of doing policy on the council level. And so I think it is important. It's an educational piece as well, because as this all gets updated, I'm hoping that there's greater clarity, even down to the traffic study stuff as to what we're doing, how that all works. And, so it makes it clearer for the planning commission.
Is that where we bring our ideas to? I mean, do we get to bring those ideas, these kind of things?
Yeah, absolutely. At the joint sessions, yeah. No, they're not super long. I mean, the answer is yes. I mean, it's not as detailed as this discussion has been, but they run an hour plus and somewhere in that, but absolutely, yeah. And I would, that's going to be one of those things that just, it's a round table and like.
Might be a good idea to
Yeah.
coordinate, you know what I mean? So we have kind of a mission going in. This is our goal to talk about on this one particular.
It might be
event,
good to.
two sessions.
Exactly. I mean, talk to Tracy, Hensley, and, coordinate that maybe through Matt, through you, and
Yep.
to say, this is what we'd like to make sure we hit the list versus the shotgun approach that has been historically because some people do monopolize a little bit, so it's, I'm not, so your points are out there, yeah. Okay.
And just so that I understand what the rules are, if we talk about these items as a group, or a couple at a time, or in a group email, there's not really any quorum issues because we're just simply coordinating subject matter to bring
Yeah.
to the joint sessions, correct?
I would say that maybe just to avoid, and I would agree, these are legislative, you're making a recommendation. I would
Right.
say if it's something you have authority over, I would not want you to do any email exchanges, But on a legislative action, it's probably less problematic. So I think.
Okay.
What I would, maybe let's do this. Let's, at the next work session on February 13th, if you guys can come back maybe with that list, and I mean, we could build these things and hold them on the side. I don't know when exactly when these things are going to happen, but that way we have these items and it's like, okay, when we get to that point, then we'll have set that aside for a discussion during a public meeting. And that way there's no perceptions or anything about.
You're saying distill down our topics
Yeah,
in this
Yeah,
setting.
that might be, yeah, exactly.
And then go forward. Okay.
Yeah,
Is that cool with everybody?
yeah. So come back and we can have that conversation. That way there's no issues about, even though it's a recommendation, it gets weird when you start doing email exchanges. I just would like to avoid that.
You can get mission creep a little bit
Yeah.
through there. So, yeah, I'm with you.
Just in the world and understand these ideas, get on board with it.
Yeah,
Quit fighting.
yeah. Well, I think there's education here, and we have not, to be honest with you, since back in the day, so to speak, that may have been one of the last times there was like a full-on discussion about these items. And I think people were like just kicking back thinking, well, there's never going to be anything that happens here. Well, that's not true. And that's what we talked about, which is, doing nothing is worse than planning for something. I mean, that's really the situation. I mean,
The world still happens around you.
it's still growing. It's just going to not be controlled as much as it would be if you had planned for it. So, I mean, that's kind of the issue.
That's why you got to plan for it, so we can control it.
Yeah, yeah.
And again, if you fight growth, you think you're fighting growth, you're not, you're making it worse.
But that was all I had for updates. So at your discretion, Chair Ellison, you are free to ask questions or close the meeting down.
I'd like to start with Commissioner Jarosh.
I have one question for Don, if I could. Don, it's a little off topic, but do you happen to know when the historic depot overlay might go to the city council?
Great question. I don't have a date for you.
That's okay.
Yeah, I can circle back with Jamie on that and ask her what she's thinking.
Okay, I was just curious. Thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you, Judy. Okay, anybody else have anything they want to close out before we make a motion?
I have one more thing, just in case you think I'm here sitting by the pool all day. It snowed most of the day today.
You look a little sunburned,
Yeah.
Judy. I'm just want to throw that
No,
out
it
there.
snowed most of the day, and there were actually golfers out in it.
You
I
have to
couldn't believe
hide
it
your
anyway.
umbrella on your beverage a little better from the camera.
So just so you know, it's cold here too.
Okay, since there's no other comments or items, I'd like to get a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, we are adjourned. Thank you, Canby. Good evening.